grow the fingers from a fist into 2 fists, and then 5, and then 100, and then 1,000.
You're listening to one of my favorite villains in recent cinema.
Are you watching, Father?
A man who, 28 years later, after an infected outbreak, has become the leader of a satanic cult where everyone shares his name.
It's because we haven't been properly introduced. Fingers.
Jimmy.
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 I'm Jimmy too, we're all Jimmy.
And in this moment, he's planning to expand that cult into an army, one that can carry out their so-called acts of charity, ritual sacrifices.
We travel the land. We search for souls to deliver to my Father. And we offer you charity.
As offerings to Old Nick.
When you say Old Nick, you mean Satan?
Of course I fucking do.
Because he believes he's the devil's son, meaning the antichrist. But what I like about this moment is how it ties into one of the saga's underlying themes, war.
So that no community in Hell's Kingdom can be guarded against our charity.
And that's what I want to talk about today. The subtext of the 28 Days Later saga, especially the 2 most recent films, and what, beneath something that at first feels like just another infected narrative, is really being said about our own world. But I think to really understand my point, it's best to go back to the segment that inspired this essay.
On account of all the people we lost in the past. So once you walk onto that mainland, you're on your own, you understand?
There's a detail that, to me, completely recontextualizes 28 years later, and it happens the moment Jamie and Spike leave the island.
11, 17, 32 the day before. Moving up and down again.
At that point, Danny Boyle makes a pretty bold choice, bringing in the poem Boots, a piece about the psychological weight of war, and layering it over images from different conflicts.
There's no discharge in a war.
So what's this, Spike?
And right from the start, that tells us something about these people, because they're essentially living in a constant state of war. That's why the line, "there is no discharge in war," speaks so directly to the condition they're trapped in. But what's most interesting is the implication behind the decision to intercut shots of the protagonists with footage of different wars throughout history, because it suggests that what we're watching is just one more entry in a long gallery of conflicts, as if this regression is simply part of an endless cycle humanity can't seem to break. And neither can we, as viewers, because the images are assembled through the edit in an almost subliminal way, overwhelming our senses, just as those images of human misery overwhelmed the monkeys in the opening of the first film. Which, in case you don't remember, were being used by scientists to develop the virus, perhaps precisely as a kind of biological weapon, which means you could argue that war has been present since the very genesis of the saga, and throughout it.
Shoot everything. Targets are not free. We've lost control.
But I think this new trilogy presents that idea of war in a really interesting way. For example, going back to this idea of war as something cyclical, the choice of the island where the survivors live isn't random. The so-called Holy Island, Lindisfarne, because the entire plot can be read as echoing a situation that took place back in 793, when Christians ran into a Viking invasion. For them, it was basically the 8th century equivalent of an alien invasion, a total clash with an unknown enemy that felt like the absolute end of times. And there's even a clear nod to that history with a Scandinavian soldier.
You know what Berserk is? Berserk is better. It's like crazy fucking Viking warrior.
He's another man coming from the north by sea, and he even calls the Alphas berserkers, which were literally Viking warriors who fought with this blind, uncontrollable fury.
I'm actually a Viking.
Obviously, that choice isn't random. It's kind of pointing at this idea that war just keeps repeating itself throughout history, which is reinforced by those sequences where shots of children with bows are intercut with images of archers from other eras, or even through one of the final lines in the Bone Temple.
This becomes a kind of a cornerstone of European post-war political philosophy, to never forget.
Which proves that you don't need to make a war film to talk about war, although, to be honest, the entire saga is proof of that.
I promised them women.
Where you get images that could easily be taken straight out of a war zone. In the first one, you have the military committing power abuses, like taking hostages or those frames that look like prisoners of war. In the second, you see them attacking civilians. In every case, the state fails.
There's no government, no police, no army.
And that's part of what made the saga so interesting. The first two films weren't really focused on the infected, but on the people who were supposed to protect others from them, the military.
We must be a disappointment. You were hoping for a full brigade, an army base with helicopters and a field hospital.
Here, they're basically the real antagonists, and Boyle's take on them is pretty critical.
If you don't put it on the ground right now, I'll kill you both. She's not infected.
And you can see how that same critical view of the military carries over into 28 years later, where Eric, the soldier, sees that an infected can give birth, and his instinct is to destroy it. But what I really like is that these two new films introduce a character who feels like the perfect counterpoint to the worldview presented by the antagonists. And to me, one of the most interesting heroes the genre has seen, because he proposes a different kind of solution to the apocalypse. And that's what I want to focus on. But before we get into that, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Surfshark VPN. Because if you've ever tried to watch a movie only to realize it's not available in your region, then with a VPN like Surfshark, you can simply change your virtual location and unlock catalogs that normally wouldn't be accessible where you are. And the same goes for video games that aren't available in your country, or even things like flights or train tickets, where prices can sometimes vary depending on where you're buying from. But beyond that, Surfshark is really about something even more important, protecting your online privacy. In simple terms, a VPN works like a secure tunnel between your device and the internet. So when you connect, your data gets encrypted, which means it becomes unreadable to third parties, keeping your activity hidden from trackers, network providers, or anyone trying to peek in. Personally, for extra protection, I think the best option is the Surfshark One bundle, since it lets you protect unlimited devices and also includes Surfshark antivirus, so you're covering multiple things at once. And the best part is, there's no risk in trying Surfshark, because they offer a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you're interested, go to surfshark.com/Lancelotti, or use code Lancelotti at checkout to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN.
Doctor? We don't have a doctor. I haven't had a doctor here in forever.
Dr. Kelson, Dad. The fire.
Before we fully dive into Kelson, I think it's important to set a bit of context with the two protagonists of 28 years later, and how the film builds things up before we get to him, especially in the way it plays with your expectations.
We're all excited for you. Even though, you know, I feel he's a bit young. 14 or 15 is more in keeping with practice.
He's ready, Jenny. Come on, lad.
Basically, father and son leave the island so the kid can have his first encounter with the infected, almost like a ritual, and as you can probably guess, it doesn't go well. And what's really interesting is that this setup, a father figure and a kid forced to grow up too fast because of the danger, is basically a trope of the genre that we've seen 1,000 times. From the man and the boy in the road, to the Grimes in The Walking Dead, and of course Joel and Ellie, among many others. But the thing that gets me about this movie is that it's fully aware that you know this trope, and it uses that against you by doing the exact opposite of what you'd expect, because you'd think the whole movie would be about these two characters struggling to survive in the wild. But the reality is that by the 40-minute mark, they're already back home. And what I love about this is how it's a constant exercise in subverting the audience's expectations in every possible way.
One day I took a group of us close to Kelson's. Right? 500 yards out, we started to smell death.
For instance, once Spike gets back home, he doesn't stay long before heading out again. Only this time, he's with his sick mother because he believes Dr. Kelson, this marginalized guy the whole community thinks is insane,
Dr. Kelson is odd.
How's he odd?
might actually be able to help. And of course, at first it's presented as a threat.
We turned and ran. And in 15 years, none of us have been back.
And again, the film is playing with what you expect, setting up what feels like a third act full of chaos and blood. But when we finally meet him,
You Dr. Kelson?
I am.
we get the opposite of what you'd expect from a climax in this kind of movie.
Remember, you must love.
Tenderness. And that's what makes it so interesting. It's not just how he acts, but the philosophy he represents, and how it pushes against the dominant worldview of that world.
The best are peaceful, where we leave each other in love.
Especially when you connect it to the way he hints at a possible cure in the second film. Because if the whole saga begins with a doctor injecting rage, the Bone Temple flips that idea.
I'm a doctor, Samson. I'd like to try treating the psychosis.
The solution might be another doctor taking that rage away.
Did it work, my friend? Were you lost and now found?
And in a way, Kelson's attempt to exercise that rage is both scientific and spiritual. And I think the film reinforces that by drawing this really interesting parallel between the Jimmies and the infected themselves, which you can even see visually in how the way Kelson talks to Jimmy mirrors how he interacts with Samson, the alpha infected. And I don't think that's a coincidence.
You must be seeing something that isn't there. Seeing something that isn't there. A doctor would call that psychosis.
What Kelson realizes is that the virus isn't just biological. It's psychological. And in a way, fanaticism works the same way. It spreads from person to person like a mental infection, which is why it makes sense that the other threat in the film is also a group of extremists, driven by blinding delusions, almost like the infected themselves. But the truth is, they're not the only ones trapped in extremes. One thing the first film really emphasizes is that Spike's community, which at first feels like a normal group just trying to survive, slowly starts revealing something else. Little by little, the film begins to frame them as a community with sect-like traits, their own symbols, rituals, and dogmas.
If you don't come back, no one is permitted to go and find you.
Maybe because, in a world in crisis, everyone seems to drift toward extremes, and Spike has simply moved from one sect-like group to another, just a more violent and radical one.
I think your name is Jimmy.
And it makes sense that a story where war is one of its central themes would emphasize fanaticism and radicalization as part of the problem. After all, that's usually the fuel behind most conflicts. And the infected feel like an exaggerated version of it, blinded by the need to eliminate a dehumanized enemy, much like those who take part in war. And in a way, I think that idea, the danger of that dynamic, has been there since the very beginning of the saga.
Security, we have a break-in. Get the sector.
If you don't remember, it all started with a group of animal rights activists breaking into a lab to free monkeys that were being experimented on. And of course, that's part of Danny Boyle's critique of biological weapons and the danger of humans playing God.
Infected with what?
But I also think the choice of virus is really interesting.
Rage.
In this case, it's artificially induced in the monkeys by exposing them to images of human misery. And it's no coincidence that the result isn't a creature trying to survive, like a traditional zombie, but one driven purely to eliminate. The virus doesn't just infect the body, it amplifies something already there. That's exactly why the climax of the first film hits so hard. You have Jim, our once civilized hero, taking down these soldiers without even using a weapon. Just his bare hands in this raw, animalistic way, reduced to something almost beast-like, to the point the camera almost frames him as one of the infected. And I think what Boyle is really saying with this is that this state of fury isn't something exclusive to the zombies. And you see it in Jim, sure, but also in so many other characters, like that literal fire burning in the soldier's eyes. And you can see it even in Eric, who's supposed to be our window into the civilized world.
I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of inbreeding around these parts, but this seems unlikely.
Who feels like someone shaped by an extreme belief system, even if it comes with its own set of, again, dogmas and prejudices.
Quarantine is for any poor f***er who puts one toe on this island. You hit land, you never leave.
But I especially like his presence because it tells you a lot about the world outside the island and how the island is perceived.
What's that?
Soon it's a brick, but for a few more moments it's something like a radio.
It shifts the usual framing of the genre because instead of a global apocalypse, what we get is something much more unsettling. A local one. Because the idea of the end of the world is universal and timeless, sure. But the idea of a region being abandoned and left to collapse on its own, that's way more real and more disturbing because it's happened before. And in many ways, it's still happening. And this idea of playing with emerging fears is of course nothing new for the saga.
I expect new things to appear over the years, but you can't predict when and where.
I don't think we're ever far from the next pandemic.
Looking back, when the first movie came out, one of its biggest selling points was the actual possibility of a global pandemic, and that whole raw realism and the handheld camera style, which felt like a news report, really sold that idea. And in a way, some of those images ended up feeling almost prophetic, to the point where that empty fictional London started to look small compared to the real thing. And by 2020, images from reality had already outweighed those of fiction, so it makes sense that this new trilogy moves away from the fear of a biological virus, something that reality has almost made feel outdated, and instead focuses on something much more specific to our time, a psychological virus. Because we're living in an era where radicalism and fanaticism feel more present than ever, and where the threat of war is once again looming in the background, that's why I find Kelson such an interesting character. While everyone else adopts a fundamentally war-driven mindset, he represents the opposite. He doesn't want to eliminate enemies, he wants to heal them. You can see this both with Kelly, the Satanist, and with Samson. Both of them, in a way, are prisoners of these psychological viruses, and both are transformed simply by crossing paths with him. And I think an extension of that philosophy can be found in the film's final line, in that sort of epilogue, especially in this idea of not destroying your enemy.
At the end of the Second World War, instead of bankrupting Germany, the world helped it rebuild. Likewise, Japan. So within a generation, they had recovered into economies that had outstripped.
It starts with a line that basically takes Kelson's philosophy and expands it to a global scale. The idea is that after World War II, the enemy wasn't just wiped out, they were helped.
Better than fair. It's desirable. Why help your defeated enemy?
And in the same way, Kelson isn't trying to eliminate the infected. He wants to cure them.
Most wondrous would be to hear you speak a single word.
But there's another idea there too, the importance of remembering so we don't keep repeating the same mistakes.
Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it.
Yes, very good.
That's why that final dialogue about never forgetting so that history doesn't repeat itself carries so much weight. And the script places such a huge importance on memory that one of the most beautiful scenes is actually Samson recovering his own memories. And maybe that's the real antidote for humanity, reclaiming our memories so we don't keep repeating the same history over and over. And it's precisely these kinds of details that make this one of the most compelling takes the genre has seen in recent years. Because, through everything I've pointed out, Boyle and Garland aren't really talking about zombies or the infected anymore. They're using them as a metaphor for extremism, the kind that inevitably leads to war, and the kind of extremism Jimmy embodies so well. Because if anyone could be considered the antichrist, it's someone who seeks out war with every breath they take. And I think the endings of both films have a lot to say in that regard. As I said, Kelson doesn't want to wipe them out. He wants to cure them. To keep Memento Mori in mind, sure, but also
Memento Amoris.
And I know it might sound a bit cheesy, but I don't think I'm saying anything the film itself isn't already suggesting when I say that through love for one another, he may have found the cure for the apocalypse. Maybe he understood that, whether it's the end of the world or just another war, rage was never cured with more rage.
I've been searching under rocks and stone.